If you want people to sacrifice, to be deeply committed to you, the team, and the purpose of the organization, they have to know that they can be vulnerable, but they also need to know that we're also looking out for their interests.
Welcome to Suffolk's Lessons in Leadership podcast, where we have authentic, wide-ranging conversations on leadership. Each conversation is a deep dive between external experts and Suffolk team members, and is designed to help our people build their leadership skills, think creatively, and redefine what's possible. Today, we're coming to you from Normandy, France, the location of the World War II D-Day invasion. We're going to explore what this sacred historical site can teach us all about leadership. This is Colonel Todd Woodruff. Todd is an Army combat veteran and currently the director of the West Point Leadership Center at the United States Military Academy. We're also joined by Pete Tufo, president of our national gaming, as well as the Gulf Coast of Florida, and Puneet Mahajan, our CFO. Today's topic is how to lead others in high-pressure situations. I'm Jay Tangney, your host for today's podcast. So we thought we'd start this morning with a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the things that we've done with Todd in the past couple of months prepping for Normandy. The team that's over here spent a few hours with Todd and did some homework that he had provided to learn about the concepts and many of the leadership topics that you work on with the cadets at West Point and throughout your career in the Army. Do you want to talk about some of those things just to give people kind of a background on things that we've been thinking about and working with you on for the past couple of months?
Sure. So I thought what I might do is share kind of an overview of those concepts and then in smaller chunks just ask you two gentlemen some questions regarding how you think they might apply at Suffolk. So one of the things that we've talked about is this notion of unbeatable teams being based and driven by trust and trust-based relationships and trust-based leadership. We also know that in dynamic, challenging environments, that leaders must have an orientation towards action and ownership. That this drive to make things happen, to move action forward, is incredibly important and powerful. Then lastly, that leaders and followers need to act with courage. And in most cases, that comes down to moral courage. The understanding that you have to do what's right, even when doing what's right is uncomfortable, creates risk, that fundamentally we are always pursuing this desire to do what's right and exercising prudent risk and courage in order to get those things done. So I thought I might start with this concept of trust. Right? And one of the things that we've talked about is this notion that in order for trust to exist, there's three fundamental elements that have to be present. And that first is that leaders have to be perceived as competent. And competent is really context driven. It might be slightly different for you and Puneet than for you, and certainly different in some of the things that I've done. But the people we're engaged with have to look to us and say, I believe that this individual is capable of making good decisions, of acquiring and allocating resources, mitigating risk, bringing together the team, and getting things done. If you're doing that, and there's that perception of competence, then you've met the first condition for trust. The second element that we're going to look at is caring. If you want people to sacrifice, to be deeply committed to you, the team, and the purpose of the organization, they have to know that they can be vulnerable, they have to know that they can assume risk, make mistakes, but they also need to know that we're also looking out for their interest. We're looking out for their professional interest, we're looking out for their personal interest, we care about their families, we care about their physical and their mental well-being. When that's present, you've met the second condition for trust. And the third one is that we expect our leaders to act with character. They expect leaders to be honest, to act with integrity, and to exercise moral courage. If you do that, you've met the third condition for trust. The interesting thing about the relationship between those three things, the competence, the caring, and the character, is that you can't fail in one and compensate with the other two. If one is absent, then trust is absent. Just imagine for a minute if you are deeply caring about the people you're responsible for, all the members of your team and your teammates. You would sacrifice for them. You would put their interest above your own. They truly believe that you care. You tell the truth, you're honest, you act with integrity, you act within the values of the organization, but yet the decisions you make cause the organization and the team to fail, and fail routinely and fail big. They may love you, they may want to spend time with you, but they don't trust you. On the other hand, you can imagine a situation where you are that competent, you are that good, your decisions make stuff happen, but you also are willing to throw your teammates under the bus. You do things out of self-interest, you do things that causes professional and personal harm to other people. You may be making great decisions, you may be very honest, but if you don't care about them, they're not going to trust you. And you can carry that forward through the entire kind of equation, but all those elements have to be present. When they are present, it's pretty powerful. People are willing to be vulnerable. People will trust you. They're open to your influence. And when they're open to your influence, they're committed. They're willing to sacrifice for the team, for the organization, for the mission, and for each other. And when you do that, that's when you start to have the basis of building an undefeatable team. Now, Pete, I was going to ask you, what do you think that looks like with your team and your part of the organization?
So thank you, Todd. Very, very insightful. And I would say there are so many parallels in what you just talked about to what we do every day out in the field and putting together buildings, right? So we collaborate and we put together teams. And those teams put together very detailed plans. But as we all know, those plans change. And that ability to react and adapt to those changes out there really have brought the teams together. And this whole idea of trust and being vulnerable, if we've learned anything over the years, things don't get better with time. So that trust in being able to say, this is wrong, something happened, bringing that to your superior or to the team leader and being able to then sit down and come up with a plan to react to what happened has truly brought teams together.
Great. How about you, Puneet? What do you think?
So firstly, thank you. And I love the simplicity of what you've tried to at least instill in us between purpose and trust, and then the three components of trust between competence, caring, and character. I would say the biggest element for us as a company is, and from a leadership perspective, and quite frankly, it just goes to everyone in the day-to-day, trust in business is no different than trust in personal life. We're always looking for people that we can trust in, because then we know we can take what they say and not have a bias on what their underlying motive might really be. Early in my career, somebody told me you can't teach tall, and what that effectively means is when it comes to competence, you can't fake it. Competence is learned as much as it's taught, and so for people like you have people in the field that they're continuously building their skill. And that builds competence. And when you're sitting with teams, they want to make sure when you're contributing and you're saying something, they can take it for what it's worth. And I 100% agree with you. It's probably one of the three things that is table stakes in discussions, and people expect you to have it. Caring for me is very much to each their own. Everyone shows it differently. Some people are bear huggers and they show it overtly. Some people, like myself, I'm an introvert. And for me, the way I show caring can be very different, but I care, right? And so everyone has to take it and demonstrate it in a different way. But every person that joins our organization should absolutely, absolutely know we care. We care about their person. We care the fact that they made a choice to join and stay with this company. We want to give them a career. We don't want to just give them a job. We want to train them. We want to give them the skills that help them make better. And then character is what makes people stay and stick. From a personal level, you have to have the courage to choose what jobs you want to be on. There are some people who would say, hey, listen, I'd rather take what is a big team, a big project, more likely to be successful. There are others who would have the courage to say, listen, this is going to be a tough one, but I'm going to learn a lot, I'm going to work with some great people, and I want to have the courage to do it. As a leader, I think the best leaders I have worked for, and John Fish is absolutely one of them, is you have to have the courage to change. The hardest thing for people to do is change. And I'll illustrate it with an example that we've just lived. 5 years ago, this company was focused very much on commercial buildings. It was easy. That's what we knew. That's what we grew up doing. We had no reason to change. It was profitable. Clients knew us, and our presidents were doing a phenomenal job. But we had to change. And when you're doing well, there's no impetus for change. And you're trying to drive that. It takes courage. And this leadership team and John had the courage to want to change, and we are better off for it and to be able to take it forward. So those are some of the examples and how I think about leadership and our role, but I think what you have taught us applies to an individual at every level in the company.
I think that's right, and those are some really good examples. And I do want to ask you all about innovation as we get maybe a little bit deeper into this. If I'm a young employee at Suffolk Construction, regardless of whether I'm in operations or functions, and I'm sitting here listening to, really decades of experience, what are one or two things, and I'll start with you, sir, that I can do individually and sort of deliberately to become a better leader, a stronger leader, as I think about advancing through my career?
It's a great question. And of course, I think I would encourage anyone to be reflecting on the discussion that we just had. You mentioned this applies to your personal life, this applies to your professional life. We're here in Normandy at the site of the D-Day invasion and the point at which the Allies begin to win World War II. The research I had mentioned and kind of our discussion here was based on examining trust in high-risk environments. But as you mentioned, it translates to business, it translates to professional life, it translates to your personal life, right? And that's because being vulnerable and trusting it's a human feeling. It's kind of part of who we are, and it transcends situations and contexts. And I think that's part of what makes it powerful. So if I was a young man or woman and I'm looking at developing as a leader within this organization, I'm thinking about that question. How do I generate trust? Trust among my teammates? How do I get my boss to trust me? And how do I get people I need to collaborate with or lead to trust me? And I don't mean that in a transactional way, like how do I get them to do something? I'm thinking about how do you become that person? How do you become that leader that when they look at you, they say, I trust you. I trust you because I believe that you're competent and you're trying to become more competent each day and you're investing in that competence. I trust you because you do show me that you care. You don't just tell me you care, you show me you care. And that through your actions, when it's easy and when it's hard, you're acting with integrity and you're being honest, and not just when it benefits you or not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. And I'd just add to that another element, and that is this notion that, Pete, you'd said stuff happens all the time, right? Who knows what it's going to be, right? Leaders have to take initiative and leaders have to act. If you want to be a leader in any organization, if you want to have greater responsibility, you have to be willing to act. You have to take ownership. And that means when you see something and something's going wrong, you don't look at it and say, gee, that doesn't seem right. I hope somebody does something about that. Or that looks like it goes sideways. I hope somebody stops and corrects that. Or I hope somebody takes some initiative to move that in the right direction. Nobody needs a position or role or formal authority to do what is right, to take ownership and to take initiative. So as leaders, we should always be saying, what else can I do? What needs to be done in this situation? If this isn't going right, what needs to happen to make it go right, to get it back onto course? And that doesn't mean you don't talk laterally to each other to communicate, but it means that we take initiative and that we take ownership and that we're willing to take some prudent risk to make things happen and to put things back on track. And it doesn't require you to be the CFO, it doesn't require you to be CEO, it just requires you to care and to have some competence and a willingness to take some initiative.
It's a great point, sir, and it's a point that I think has a certain element of personal risk, especially if you're, maybe not as high up in the chain of command or the food chain. A good example, and Pete, maybe you can talk about it. I know we talk about it quite a bit when we bring people on board. If you're on a job site and you see something unsafe, no matter where you are in that chain of command, and no matter how much pressure there is on that job site that day to get things done, because when people ask me about Suffolk, I always describe it as a today place. Today, a certain amount of work needs to happen on 125 projects around the country, no matter what, or there's consequences to the owner, to our employees, to the financials, to the outcome, to the schedule, everything. So there's pressure to perform, just like there is in the Army. Pete's job sites have to do a certain amount of things every day to get things done. And when there's an unsafe condition on a job site, what should people do as leaders?
They should absolutely step up, and I will tell you that is actually riddled in trust. You can't make that decision at somebody at whatever level you are to talk about an unsafe condition and actually stop progress if you don't have trust. And I tell every young person that comes into our industry, and frankly any emerging leader, this is first and foremost a relationship business. You could take all those technical skill sets you have, and they will get you so far. But if you invest in those relationships at every level throughout your entire career, they pay dividends. Maybe not immediately, although they are pretty quickly, you can pretty quickly determine the benefits of developing those relationships, but they will pay dividends throughout your entire career. And I look back on, hundreds of projects I've done throughout my career, and every time a challenge has come up that was successfully, whatever you define success as for that challenge, whenever it was resolved, it wasn't resolved because we technically proved somebody incorrect. It's because there was a relationship there that somehow, some way we found common ground to resolve the issue and move forward. And I think when I look back on my career, if I would have known that at 26, it would have been really beneficial. So I spent a lot of time teaching emerging leaders and talking to people coming in. Focus on those relationships, and you can't have those relationships unless you have the 3 C's. So to bring it back to where we started, you have to have those 3 C's to actually generate that level of relationships that lead to trust, that lead you to have an open and honest dialogues, irrespective of your position on any project.
I was just going to build on what Pete said, Jay. I think 2 leadership traits that are super critical to build that culture within the organization. 1, the leader is willing to listen and truly listen, right? So
Hear.
people have
Listen
to
and hear, right?
People have to believe that if they say something, the leadership is going to listen to it, or the leader is going to listen to them and truly do something. 2nd, the leader is willing to have the courage to be decisive. There are a lot of leaders out there who would say, I don't want someone playing Monday morning quarterback and second guessing my decision in the moment. You have to have the courage and the conviction to be decisive in that moment, to make that decision, whether it is a tactical one or a relationship-based long-term view, and be comfortable in your skin to say, okay, this is how we are going to take it forward. If teams don't believe that culture exists, I think they say nothing, and become passive doers, if you will, or they just believe no matter what I say that my leader doesn't have the courage to make a decisive decision, so nothing is going to happen even if I say it.
Right, and then the next time they won't say it.
Correct.
And there can be really, intended and unintended consequences of that can be extreme, especially in a business like ours where safety is paramount, also similar to the Army.
And as you know, in our business, nothing ages well, right? We say that all the time. So if our people don't have the confidence to raise their hand at the right point early, it's not going to have a good outcome.
And to add to that, I also think it's the leader's role, right? There are times where you want to be inclusive and you want everyone's opinion, but actually making that tough decision. So finding that balance of, I've heard everybody, everyone's had a chance to voice their concerns, and this is the direction we're taking. And then have also that trust in those relationships built, that while there may be 4 people in the room and there were 2 different opinions, we collectively, when we leave this room, implement one decision and all come out as a unified team. And I think that really ties back to the relationships of the people in the room, that you may disagree in the room, whatever that leadership team is, but when you agree, when you make a decision, the action, everyone is on board and going full speed ahead, and you don't have detractors. And again, I take all this and I think it all goes back to the relationships.
So that's a really important and subtle point, I think, in the conversation we're having. Because the real test here, the concepts you're talking about, Todd, and what we're all discussing on our job sites, is when things go poorly, right? It's easy to be a great leader when everything's wonderful, right? No matter what kind of leader you are. The test of your leadership is when things aren't wonderful, and that's when people have to feel trusting enough to come forward and share their views. The point you're making, Pete, is what I want to talk about. When people get into those situations, leadership doesn't necessarily mean force of will, right? It means taking other people's opinions and hearing them, listening and hearing them, processing them. And leaders are different. Some people process different opinions transparently and openly. Some people process sort of more internally. But that leader still has to make a decision. How important is it for that discipline on the team when a leader makes a decision that everyone doesn't agree with, which is inevitable in high-pressure leadership situations, right? Not everyone's going to agree all the time. And what can a leader do to make sure that the team is on board, knowing that not everyone agrees all the time?
For sure, that is the case. That is part of the nature of leadership, is that you are making decisions, you are providing purpose, direction, and motivation to the team, and you're never going to have complete consensus. But as you mentioned, this notion of, I've listened. We have a saying in the military, and everybody has a voice, not everybody has a vote. But this notion that if you want to have positive influence with people, you really do have to listen. You have to understand. I think that's part of being competent, is to say a humility, and an intellectual humility, and a knowledge that no matter how long we've been doing our respective jobs, there are other people out there that have something to contribute, that the collective knowledge of the team is often greater than the individual. And we saw that yesterday in the exercise we were doing when we put stuff together. But as a leader, as you listen to people, as you start to leverage that collective intelligence, people recognize when their voice is being heard, when they have an opportunity to contribute. It's okay to say, Panita, I heard you, and you have a great point. In this circumstance, I'm actually, I'm leaning towards what Jay had said and my initial thoughts on something, and that's the direction we're going to go. But I appreciate what you said, and it's certainly valid, but in this direction is where we're heading now. People understand that. They appreciate having the opportunity to share and understand that we're not always going to agree. But I think that's particularly the case when you're in a dynamic environment and things change quickly, and you have to, you'd mentioned a couple things that resonated with me in terms of underwriting risk. It's not just as I said earlier, hey, emerging leaders need to step up, take initiative, be action oriented, and own the situation regardless of their current role, that everybody can speak up to correct something that's unsafe or going poorly. But the other side of that equation is that as a leader, we have to underwrite that risk. We have to say, I appreciate that initiative. I appreciate you stepping up to do what is right, and recognize that sometimes they're not going to get it right. Sometimes they may have missed something. Maybe they didn't appreciate the entire context. But when they're trying to do what is right, we need to support them, underwrite that, and if it didn't go well, to coach them to understand how they could do it better next time, and tell them, keep doing what's right, keep taking initiative, keep taking ownership, because a leader who crushes initiative, a leader who punishes when a mistake is made rather than supports, coaches, and corrects, is going to create the culture and the conditions where initiative and moral courage is hard to exist.
So, incredibly well said, and I couldn't agree more. Part of the content of what you just said, Todd, makes me think about mentorship, and that's something we spend a lot of time on at Suffolk Construction. Pete, how do you as a leader mentor young people so they get to a place like the one Todd just described, where they can speak up, where they're confident, they know that even if you disagree, they're not going to be punished, and that you have their back, and that everyone can execute on whatever the leadership decision is without that dissent? And how do you mentor people to get to that point as they begin their careers and as they go through them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It continues to evolve, Jay. In my experience, I have found first, and I'm going to go back to the relationship. You have to develop the relationship with the individual so that you can have those difficult conversations or challenging conversations, and still walk out of the room feeling good about it. The second part is, I learned a long time ago there's two types of listening. You can listen to respond, or you can listen to learn. And I think when dealing as a leader, when you're in the room, this isn't like playing volleyball back and forth where someone's saying something, you immediately have a response. Like, you have to take, and if there's 3 or 4 people in the room, you have to listen across the room to learn, to then take all the information, to then make an educated decision. And then if you happen to go against someone's opinion, a follow-up meeting one-on-one, part of that mentor of, look, I understand where you were coming from. This is why we made the decision to go in a different direction. I want you to continue voicing your concerns because you brought up some great points. But I think that constant feedback loop is another way to mentor people, because I think a lot of times if they don't feel like their voice was heard and they're not hearing the positive of what they said, it doesn't go very well. And that positive reinforcement all the time for some of our young professionals, and I work in a region right now that has a lot of young professionals going into, that I'm mentoring into higher positions as the region continues to grow, and spending the time getting to know them, putting them in situations, allowing them to come up with their own decisions, and then come back and communicate. I found that that's the best way to mentor.
So Pete raises a topic that I think is really important in this day and age where multitasking is a reality. People are on Teams calls and Zoom calls, and they're sending email while they're supposed to be, what I would say is active listening, right? And people are smart. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself, where we'll be in a meeting and something comes up either on my phone or, on the laptop, and I become distracted as a leader. And people see that, right? Because people are bright and they're paying attention. How do leaders or how should leaders focus more on active listening with their teams, to pick up on Pete's point, to be actively present all the time? Because one of the things that I've read about and learned about is if you are up there in the chain of command and you're not actively present when you're with your team, they know, they remember, it leads to a lack of trust. What can we do in this day and age of constant information flow to avoid that and become much more active listeners as leaders?
I think it's a big point, Jay, and I think it's hugely important too, because we leaders have to be present. We often forget that when we are interacting with somebody in the organization, it might be the only interaction that person may have with you, or they've spent 1 week preparing for that one 30-minute conversation. If we walk into that and we are not present in that conversation, that erodes trust. You would have been better off not having that conversation as opposed to having that conversation and them thinking that you were not actively present there. So it's data points, and I'll go back to Pete's point about mentorship. Mentorship to me is very personal. People are looking to be comfortable to listen and get mentored by other people. It doesn't follow a chain of command. And the thing leaders can do is demonstrate examples. People want to believe, but they believe even more when they've seen other people get through it. And it's very relevant when it comes to long careers inside an organization. People want to make sure that they can come in and join as an engineer, become a project manager, become a senior project manager, become a VP. And if they don't see a track, they don't see examples within the organization, we can stand on top of a mountain and yell and say we are going to give you a career, but we haven't demonstrated it. So the more examples we have, the more examples we put out there, the more people will believe and to be able to take it forward. And I want to come back a little bit towards what Todd was saying before. I think trust has to lead to motivation to drive a purpose. Trust for trust's sake means we are friends. Trust leading to motivation towards working towards a purpose is powerful. And to me, that becomes the critical element, is how do you motivate people to do the things we want them to do that ultimately serves a purpose is what we are striving to do. People fall in 3 categories: doubters, believers, and conquerors. If we can just move people up one notch, if we can make doubters become believers, believers become conquerors, we've given people the motivation to work towards a purpose.
Just to stay on this point for another couple of minutes, we all make mistakes, regardless of how experienced we are, myself included. Todd, what can a leader do to acknowledge a mistake with his or her team to try and turn it around, in your experience?
Yeah, I've got a mentor of my own who says nothing sounds like the truth except the truth. People can smell and sense BS pretty easily. So being honest and having integrity and owning those things, that's, if you want people to be vulnerable in your organization and honest and open, you have to be that person as well. And I think you said very well, provide that example. And that example could be an example of what a career looks like, but it could also be an example of the leadership that you want them to embody. It could be the values of the organization that you expect others to express in action, behaviors, and decisions. Then you have to do those yourself. And taking ownership for mistakes, acknowledging when something didn't go the way you expected it to, that's part of being an honest, trustworthy, and vulnerable leader, is leading through that personal example of taking ownership of mistakes, sharing why it happened, what you learned from it, and that helps other people get better from it.
It's an interesting concept, I think, especially for the industries and the worlds that we're in. The military is not a place that tends to favor showing vulnerability, regardless of where you are in the chain of command. Suffolk's like that too. And I think it's really hard for leaders to be deliberate, and myself included, about mistakes we make with our own teams and decisions that came out wrong. So that vulnerability, when you're on a $500 million construction site with a million things to do and a million things coming at you, is a critical concept, especially when you're high up in that chain of command. How do you manage that, Pete?
Yeah, so it's, and look, I've had some experiences over the past couple of years that would tie directly into difficult projects, difficult decisions, and how do you lead through it. And I will tell you, looking back on, an incredible challenge that we were going through, having to stand up in front of your entire team, the executive committee, and a group every morning at 6:30, walking through a very detailed plan to try and get out of a challenging situation that I was a part of getting us into, it was humbling, right? And it was vulnerable, and and it's okay to show that these things impact you. And it's okay, while you could still be a leader, things can still impact you, right? How you react to them will determine how the team members view you. So, I've been fortunate or unfortunate to have a couple of those experiences where, leadership's been tested. And again, lead with, to your point, there's nothing, the truth is the truth, right? It doesn't waver. It is what it is. We can't fix the past. We can only impact the future. Spending your time, your energies, and your efforts on the solution and bringing people together while making them feel valued, I think is one of the true tests of a leader.
Puneet?
Yeah, for me, I think we have to always look at it in the realm of risk and consequences. In general, indecision probably has the worst of all consequences. For leaders, it's got to come down to, do I need more input? Do I need more people? Otherwise, I've got to listen to what all the facts are. And ultimately, people are looking for leaders to make decisions. And it's true for life, and it's true in business. And I'll just give we are here in Normandy. One of the examples we all talked about yesterday was when Eisenhower had to make a decision on whether to go or not go.
For D-Day.
For D-Day, and it was a split vote, and he had to make a decision, and there was no going back. I mean, to me, every decision we make every day is inconsequential relative to those decisions, right? And you have to put it in perspective.
Yeah.
And so you look at that and say, okay, we have to have the courage. And the last thing I'd add to that is, you've got to then own the decision.
Which he did.
Right?
Right?
Which he did, right? And we as leaders have to own that decision and not blame other things if they don't go right.
Right.
Along the way. Others have to always look at it in the consequences, in the context of how many decisions you make every day that are right, and how many decisions that you make every day that may not be right. 80% of the decisions people make every day are absolutely correct.
Right.
And it goes to my point about motivation too, right? So if our only interaction with people is to tell them what they didn't do right, that is not motivation. Motivation is when you tell them about every little thing that they did right. You earn your right to say the one thing they didn't do right. If I came to you, Jay, and I said, hey, Jay, great job. I said it to you 10 times on 10 things you did. And then the 11th time I came and said, hey, Jay, I think you could have done this one better. The chances you trust me are a lot higher than the only time I come to you is the one time
The
you
negative
didn't do
time.
it right.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And we're going to wrap it up here in a minute. And I want to ask each of you for a takeaway from what we've been learning about so far here in Normandy in our conversation today. Just to illustrate your point about General Eisenhower, thousands of proper, correct decisions were made to get to the point where they could make the decision, where he could make the decision to go or no go. He also wrote a message to the world about what would happen if they failed, because that was a real possibility. And many things went wrong, right, during Overlord, and they overcame those things. But one of the key messages for me yesterday was there was dissent on whether they should go. And once he made the decision, everybody went. So clearly, he was living and illustrating and really behaving as the type of leader that we're talking about here this morning. So, Puneet, we'll stick with you. Give us one or two takeaways from our conversation and what you've learned about here so far in Normandy.
I would say just a couple for me. One, an absolute honor to be here. And I've learned so much in the day and a half we've been here. both in terms of what happened here and how grateful we should all be about that, but also just in terms of how it applies to us in business every day. My biggest takeaway is, and we didn't talk much about it here, which is process is as important, if not more important, than strategy. And to me, that is something we have to go back and instill. And then the second thing for me is this concept of trust times motivation will help us achieve the purpose.
Well said. Pete?
Thank you, Jay. I'd like to echo what Puneet said. This past day and a half, it's really been eye-opening, right? It's been a humbling experience. I've always been proud to be an American. I am the son of a veteran, and who my father is very proud of his time in the service. And being here and knowing what people sacrificed so that we can have the country that we have, it truly is. It's humbling, right? And it takes a lot to make this group quiet. And we walked around yesterday in some of the most sacred ground. There weren't a whole lot of conversations. You could just see the self-reflecting and really the gratitude that we have for what our soldiers did. So that's how I'd like to start with. The other thing, in the case study we did yesterday, right, just taken away from a leadership, the case study we did yesterday where we put people together on a topic they knew nothing about, a group of people that were randomly selected, and then put them together as a team. And across the board, the outcome was better as a team than they were as an individual. And I think that says a lot to, one, the people that are in the room. So that wouldn't have happened if we didn't trust the people that were in this room, which are the leaders and emerging leaders of the organization. But just knowing that when you put Suffolk people in a room
Right.
with a common goal, whatever that goal is, right? Yesterday it was fictitious, but it was still a goal. They worked together as a team. Everybody's voice was heard, irregardless of rank. No one talked about position, title within the organization. Everybody had a voice. Everybody was heard, made a collective decision. Not everybody got their way, but they all walked out of that room or with that situation with a common goal, and then they enacted it. And it was really good to see.
And just to reset that scene a little bit, you're exactly right. We did this Arctic survival exercise where we broke up into small teams and people were given a certain amount of things to help them survive for a minimum of 14 days. And those teams had to identify and prioritize what of those things, axe, matches, tarp, in what order they thought was necessary for them to survive, right? And then they did an individual listing and then they did a team listing. And to your point, Pete, in every single case, every single team was materially better as a team in terms of the outcome, more likely to survive than they would have individually. And I do think that is a really central takeaway for how Suffolk is, because how these decisions get made, the process of how we make decisions as a team on project sites or in functional units is critical to the outcome of that success. And everyone having a voice, just to circle it back to the beginning, really begins with trust and their ability to come forward and trust the fact that they're part of the process regardless of where they are on the chain of command.
Yeah, and Jay, if I could add to that too, I'd also say, starting with a strategy, right? Each one of those individual tools, and again, just using the analysis yesterday of the individual tools, depending on the strategy you chose, the importance of each of those tools changes, right?
Yeah.
So if you kind of relate that back to Suffolk and what we do, we all have skill sets, right? We all have pluses and minuses, and I think as a leader, it's our job to magnify those individual strengths as opposed to highlighting their weaknesses. So how do you do that? By having a strategy. You implement the strategy and you put people in the right seats on the bus in order to maximize their strengths. You get tenfold out of that. So it was a really interesting exercise.
Agreed. Sir, conclusions?
One of the takeaways I have of walking the beaches of Omaha yesterday, and it connects to what we've talked about today, is that much of what made them successful on that day is because of what they did in the preceding 2 years. So the relationships they built, the teams they've created, the preparation, the practice, the rehearsals, the mitigation of risk, the contingency planning, all these things happened in the days, the months, and even a year or more before they actually do that. You can't build a relationship in a day. You're not going to build a team that is undefeatable in a day. And I think it just shows that as leaders, we have to be setting the conditions for success and the conditions for trust before the day you're tested.
You've been listening to Suffolk's Lessons in Leadership. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next time for another leadership conversation. Thanks so much for listening.